This week on the Red Eye podcast, we have a story about one of the things that quietly worries cabin crew more than most other things. And there is a trigger warning here if you do have a fear of flying. The thing that worries cabin crew more than most other things? Fire. The one thing that really has no place on an aircraft. The thing that can provoke fear more immediately at 36,000 feet than it ever does on the ground. And that's because we know how quickly things can get out of hand. We know that if a fire isn't contained quickly enough, time is not on our side. That's why every 3 years we refresh our practical firefighting training, and every year we revisit the theory behind it. Because while it remains extremely rare on board, fire is one of those situations where there is absolutely no room for complacency. And in recent years, the threat has become even more worrying because now we have lithium battery fires to contend with, and they behave completely differently to the others. When a lithium battery enters thermal runaway, it can generate extreme heat, flames, toxic smoke, and repeated reignitions. One battery cell overheats, and then another, and even when you think the fire is extinguished, it can flare up again minutes later. At 36,000 feet, trapped inside a pressurized aluminium tube carrying hundreds of people, that is a frightening prospect. In fact, the threat has become serious enough that airlines around the world have begun introducing specialist equipment designed specifically for lithium battery fires. Some now carry dedicated containment bags or lithium battery incident kits, recognizing that these fires behave very differently from the cabin fires crews have been trained for over decades, and most have very strict policies about where they can be carried on board. Thankfully, the chances of any individual battery failing are extremely small, and the vast majority will never cause a problem. But in a world where most passengers will carry several of them on every flight, the number of reported lithium battery incidents on aircraft has been rising steadily. In 2025 alone, the FAA recorded 93 verified incidents involving smoke, fire, or extreme heat, with power banks, mobile phones, laptops, and e-cigarettes among the most common causes. That's nearly 2 incidents every week somewhere in the aviation system. And in January 2026, an Air Busan flight almost completely burned out on the tarmac in South Korea when a device caught fire before they even took off. Thankfully, everyone was evacuated in time and no one was seriously hurt. But you have to ask, what would have happened if they'd been in the air? So this week, we're taking a closer look at the hidden danger sitting quietly in your hand luggage by taking you aboard one flight where the worst-case scenario actually happened. We'll also explore the procedures cabin crew follow when faced with fire and why, occasionally, real life might require them to adapt those procedures. Today's story hasn't been donated personally, but it is based on a report from the Australian government about this incident. And so whilst the conversations and crew members are fictional, the event did actually happen. And if this episode leaves just one person thinking twice about a damaged battery, an overheating phone, where they pack their power bank before a flight, or where they stow it on board, then perhaps we've helped, in some small way, prevent a future disaster. Doors to armed and cross-check. Welcome aboard the Red Eye. Sydney to Hobart, July 2025. Trish squeezed the lady's hand one last time. "I'll be back in a minute," she said, holding her gaze. "Now, remember what I just said." The lady nodded and dabbed at the tear that had pooled in the corner of her eye. Trish walked away to answer the call bell further up the cabin. She had a feeling that no matter what she said, 28C was never going to stop being nervous. Even though she'd just delivered her usual successful speech about statistics and probability, explaining that she'd been flying for nearly 20 years and had never crashed, never made an emergency landing, and was living proof that the numbers don't lie. The woman had listened politely and then seemed to have forgotten every word. Fear had drowned it all out. In her mind, her own statistics were somehow different from everyone else's. She was probably perfectly rational on the ground, but the moment she stepped onto an aircraft, that reasoning simply deserted her. Trish sighed. If she could, she would sit beside her for the landing and hold her hand all the way down. But there were only 4 crew working 4 doors today, so the poor thing would almost certainly spend the descent gripping the armrests and fighting back tears. There was nothing more Trish could do. Reaching row 7, she made eye contact with the 3 passengers sitting beneath the illuminated call light and smiled. "Did one of you press your call bell?" The man in 7A, seated by the window, raised a hand slightly. He looked young, with a wispy beard that hadn't quite filled in, and shoulders hunched forward with tension. "I've got a really tight connection. Do you think I'll make a 10:15 departure?" "We're arriving on time at 9 o'clock, so you should be fine," she assured him. Then, with a grin, she added, "And you're young enough to run." She switched off the call light and continued down the aisle. In the front galley, the number 1, Kim, was emptying the last of the coffee down the sink. In reality, they were both cabin managers, but Kim was new to the role, so today Trish was there to support her. If she was honest, she was quite enjoying having none of the responsibility. In fact, the whole day had been easy so far. 2 short sectors, experienced crew, decent passengers. What Trish would call a doddle. At least, so far. "Belts in 5, Kim said over her shoulder. "Everything okay out there?" Trish began helping to tidy up, stowing the last of the service items as she filled her in. "Yeah, poor 28C is almost beside herself now." She didn't need to explain further. Ever since boarding in Sydney, all 4 crew members had taken turns comforting the nervous passenger. The turbulence hadn't helped, nor had the complete indifference of the grumpy couple sitting beside her, who seemed more irritated by the fuss than sympathetic to her fear. On other flights, Trish had seen complete strangers offer a nervous flyer a hand to hold. But this pair, seemingly bitter in their later years for reasons known only to themselves, appeared determined to make her feel even more alone. Kim shot her a sympathetic look. "Oh, the poor thing. I always think nervous flyers are incredibly brave, though. At least she got on the aircraft, which is more than a lot of people manage." "So true," Trish agreed. "And 7A is worried he'll miss his connection at 10:15. I've told him he'll be fine." Kim laughed. "He'll make it. They do seem to be booking connections tighter and tighter these days. The other day, I had 20 passengers connecting through on exactly an hour, and half of them were wheelchair users. Did they make it? Well, strangely enough, most of them suddenly discovered the ability to walk once we told them they'd have to wait until the end for wheelchairs. They were practically jogging down the jet bridge." Trish chuckled. "Well, miracles do happen." The seatbelt signs illuminated. "I'll start securing. You finish up here," Trish said, stepping back into the aisle. "Roger that," Kim replied. At the back of the aircraft, Trish could see Todd starting to work his way forward, methodically stowing bags in the overhead lockers and checking tray tables and seats were upright. That left Janice finishing up the rear galley and the 2 of them to secure the 149 passengers on board this Boeing 737 between them. It's easy enough. It was a short flight, and there was a limit to how much mess people could create in an hour and 40 minutes since takeoff. At the first row, she smiled politely as she picked a discarded cup from the floor. At the second, she gestured for the lady in the window seat to raise her blind. Rows 3 and 4 were clearly occupied by seasoned travellers who knew the landing drill almost as well as she did herself. Row 5, however, was another matter entirely. Trish stopped and looked at them. Not a single seatbelt was fastened. Seats were reclined at various angles and rubbish covered the tray tables. How had they managed to create such a mess in such a short time was beyond her. "Seats up, belts on please," she said, bending to collect a handful of wrappers and paper cups. The sound made her pause. It had come from somewhere a few rows behind her. An overhead locker, perhaps. She frowned, listening for a moment before dismissing it. Maybe something had shifted during the descent. She was turning back towards the galley with the rubbish when she heard it again. This time, it wasn't a pop, though. It was more of a hiss. A strange, prolonged sound, unlike anything she could immediately place. As she stood there listening, mentally scrolling through every familiar aircraft noise she had learned over nearly 20 years of flying, a thin ribbon of white smoke began to curl from the edge of an overhead locker above 7D. For a second, she simply stared at it. And then her stomach dropped. Whatever was inside that locker had absolutely no place doing what it was doing. "Kim!" she called, forcing her voice to remain calm as her heart leapt into her throat. "Fire!" somebody shouted, leaping out of his seat and into the aisle, quickly followed by several others. Trish glanced over her shoulder and saw Kim poke her head into the cabin before disappearing towards the forward door where the emergency equipment was stowed. She had heard her. Help was on the way. "Move out! Move out!" Trish ordered, ushering the passengers away from the rows beneath the smoking locker. In her head, the firefighting drill she'd practiced countless times over the years immediately switched on. The sequence was almost as familiar as her own name. She had rehearsed it in training rigs, recited it in annual exams, and practiced it over and over. But there was one significant difference. In every exercise for at least the past 10 years, she had always been the manager, the coordinator, the person directing events, liaising with the flight deck, moving passengers, and making sure equipment reached the crew fighting the fire. But today, that role belonged to Kim. And then the realization hit her. She wasn't the manager. She was first on scene. And that meant she was the firefighter. Trish, who had spent years reassuring nervous passengers that she had never experienced an emergency, was about to fight her very first onboard fire. She swallowed hard, accepting her unwelcome calling. A quick glance out of the window confirmed they were on final approach, with approximately 10 minutes until landing, and she knew that whatever happened next would need to happen quickly. "Here!" Kim had reappeared at her shoulder, thrusting a smoke hood into her hands. Trish snapped open the catches on the hard plastic case, breaking the seal and lifting the lid. Inside, the vacuum-packed hood came out easily. She tore open the packaging using the attached strap, exactly as she had seen dozens of times in training. Next, she took out the silver hood, slipped her hands through the rubber neck seal and stretched the opening. This one felt much tighter than any training version she remembered, though, and for a moment she struggled to pull it wide enough. When she did eventually get it over her head, she shifted left and right inside, trying to move the hairs that had been pulled over her face so that she could see out of the visor, immediately feeling the familiar wave of claustrophobia she experienced every single time she put one on. Only this time, it wasn't training. She could hear the sound of her own breathing inside the hood, loud and rhythmic, and felt strangely detached from everything happening around her. She could see Kim speaking, her lips moving behind the haze of smoke, but she couldn't make out a single word. Janice was beside her now, trying to pull a hood over her head too, struggling to stretch the neck seal over her bun, while further back Todd was waving passengers away, shouting instructions as he shepherded them towards the rear of the cabin. Something was pressed into Trish's hand, and instinctively her fingers wrapped around the cold metal cylinder. A fire extinguisher. Of course. She turned back towards the locker. Kim was close to her visor now, still talking, still trying to communicate something, but between the noise of the cabin, the hood, and the adrenaline pounding through her body, it was impossible to concentrate on anything except the fire. Whatever everyone else was doing, she knew what she needed to do. Carefully, she reached up and touched the locker with the back of her hand. Training told her she should wait for protective gloves if possible, but they'd already lost precious seconds. The plastic felt hot beneath her skin. Further along, though, where the handle was only warm. Good. That meant she could get it open. Positioning herself slightly to one side, away from where the flames were most likely to erupt, she pulled the safety pin from the extinguisher and fired a quick test burst towards the floor, just as she had been taught. Then she raised the extinguisher and nodded to Janice. Janice, who had seemingly abandoned any attempt to get her own smoke hood on, reached up and carefully cracked the locker just slightly open. Immediately, a thicker cloud of smoke billowed out. Trish thrust the nozzle into the gap and squeezed the trigger hard, emptying the entire contents into the compartment. The moment it was spent, she pulled it quickly out, and Janice slammed the locker shut once again. The smoke thinned quickly. While they waited the 30 seconds before reopening the locker, Trish tugged off the smoke hood. No one else had managed to get theirs on properly, and while it might have offered protection from the immediate danger of the smoke, getting anything done whilst wearing it felt so much more difficult. "I hate those things," she said, dropping it onto a nearby seat. "I gave up," Janice admitted. "That neck seal is so much tighter than the ones in training." Todd appeared up the aisle, carrying the fire containment bag in his arms. They carried 2 on board, specifically for lithium battery fires, and if this was one of those, everyone knew that extinguishing the flames was only half the battle. There was every chance it would reignite. The popping and hissing noises suddenly made far more sense. Trish found herself remembering the photographs from this year's recurrent training. The burnt-out fuselage of an aircraft that had been destroyed following a lithium battery fire. Everyone had survived. The evacuation had been successful, and they had escaped before the flashover had taken hold. But that aircraft had been on the ground. This one wasn't. "Captain's informed," Todd said, dropping the containment bag onto an empty seat and tearing open the outer packaging. "He wants everyone seated for landing." The aircraft shuddered lightly as it descended through a patch of turbulence, a timely reminder that they only had minutes left before touchdown. Trish stepped aside to let Kim move past. "Folks, please take any available seats in the cabin," Kim called to the displaced passengers still standing in the aisle. "Double up if you need to." There were only a handful of spare seats scattered throughout the aircraft, and nowhere near enough for everyone to have one to themselves. Passengers squeezed together wherever they could, while Trish and Janice's attention remained fixed on the locker. Trish glanced at her. "Ready?" The 2 women exchanged a look and nodded before reaching up together, supporting the locker door as they lowered it carefully. As the remaining smoke drifted away, the source finally revealed itself. A large blue backpack sat inside, blackened and smouldering. Janice immediately emptied a bottle of water over it, while Trish pulled open the top flap, knowing she needed to locate the source of the fire as quickly as possible. "Whose backpack is this?" Kim, who'd been watching as she secured the passengers, called out. "A large blue backpack." She repeated the question, louder this time, but no reply came. Trish continued to search cautiously through the bag's contents. Somebody had finally produced the fire gloves, but they were so large and cumbersome that she knew she'd struggle to feel anything through them. Beside her, Janice discarded the empty water bottle and cracked open another, continuing the cooling process, and, for the moment at least, keeping the threat of reignition at bay. The aircraft suddenly lifted as it caught an air pocket, before dropping again. The ground was getting closer now. Far too quickly. Trish glanced at the fire containment bag sitting ready on the nearby seat and knew she had a decision to make. The bag was designed for a laptop, power bank, or mobile phone, not an entire backpack. And with only minutes remaining before landing, she doubted she could safely identify and isolate the offending device before they touched down, especially when nobody had yet claimed ownership of the bag. The interphone rang. The captain. Kim looked at her expectantly. "Tell him we're leaving it in place for landing," Trish said immediately. "All passengers are seated. I'll stay here and keep cooling it until I need to sit down too. I'll sit in 7C. Kim nodded and hurried towards the phone. "Thanks, Janice," Trish said, taking the bottle from her and pouring another steady stream of water over the smouldering contents. "Take your seat, love." Janice hesitated for a moment, and then nodded and moved away, leaving Trish with the water bottle in her hand as the aircraft continued its descent towards the runway. "I've left some extra bottles in there," Janice said, flicking her eyes towards the seat pockets where she'd wedged them. Trish smiled gratefully. "Oh, Janice," she called as the other woman turned away, suddenly remembering something. "Can you check on 28C as you go past? Just make sure she's okay." Janice nodded and headed quickly down the aisle. Trish watched her stop briefly at row 28 and exchange a few words before continuing to her jump seat. The aircraft was almost down now. Trish emptied the remainder of her bottle over the scorched section of the backpack. The pull-down locker had effectively become a bucket, collecting the water at its lowest point. She decided to leave it open. If she closed it, the bag would disappear from view, and one thing she wasn't prepared to do was lose sight of it. For now, the fire appeared to be out. For now. But she wasn't taking any chances. Leaving the locker open was strictly against procedure usually. Then again, so was sitting here in 7C monitoring a smouldering backpack during landing while her door was unmanned. As she pulled the seatbelt tight across her lap, she glanced one more time at the blackened bag, and the water pooled at the bottom of the locker. Procedure was one thing, but keeping her eyes on a potential fire was another, and she was confident she was making the right call. The wheels touched down with a chirp and a brief jolt before the reversers roared into life. As the aircraft slowed along the runway, Trish unclipped her seatbelt and stood up again, another bottle of water already in her hand, ready for whatever came next. But nothing came next. The bag sat sodden and forlorn in the open locker as they taxied towards the gate. The door opened and the firefighters boarded quickly, assessing the smouldering remains within moments before declaring it no longer a threat and allowing the passengers to disembark. Outside, though, Trish could still see the flashing blue lights of the emergency vehicles waiting on the apron, a stark reminder of what might have happened had things gone differently. But thankfully, it never did. "Thank you for everything." A small voice interrupted Trish's thoughts at the door, and she looked to see the lady from 28C stopped in front of her with a smile on her face. "Hey," Trish said, surprised to see her so composed. "Are you okay? I'm so sorry that happened on your flight," she apologized quickly. The lady's smile widened. "It's funny, actually," she said. "I think it might have been exactly what I needed." Trish frowned. "The couple next to me were in bits," she continued with a small laugh. "Honestly, they were convinced we were all going to die, but weirdly, I wasn't worried at all." "No?" The woman shook her head. "I knew you had it under control. I knew it was going to be okay." She reached out and touched Trish's arm lightly. For a moment, Trish didn't know what to say. "Wow," she managed eventually. "So, will you ever fly again?" The lady grinned. "Absolutely. I honestly think this might have cured me." Then she turned towards the jet bridge before pausing and looking back. "You've all cured me," she called, including Kim and the two pilots who had appeared behind them. And then she disappeared down the jetway. Trish and Kim looked at each other, mirroring each other's confused and amused expressions. "Well, I'm glad someone got something out of it," Kim said. "I think I might need a few months off." Trish smiled and looked back down the now empty cabin, wondering whether 7A had made his connection after all, or whether he'd decided that perhaps another flight could wait a little while longer. A small group of engineers had gathered around row 7, while outside a duty manager waited to escort them to the office for their debrief. Their opportunity to explain what had happened and no doubt justify a few of the decisions that they'd made along the way. But she wasn't particularly worried, because the incident had reminded her of something her instructors had always told her. Real life rarely follows a script, and today had been no exception. Procedures mattered. Training mattered. Of course they did. They were the foundation of everything. But sometimes, when circumstances changed faster than the manuals anticipated, experience and judgment and knowing that safety manual inside out mattered too. And occasionally, especially when time was running out, you had to think just a little outside of the box. The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.